Back to the daily grind, and shout out to the full-time patrons. Make sure to hit subscribe if you're new and hit thumbs up if you're not a baby back bagel biting bitch boy, cause you know what time it is. It's full time.
MMA.
It's your boy Taco Bell Wani, aka MMA Academics, and Nick Diaz is not playing that shit. Nick Diaz got wind that the UFC was supposedly trying to make Nate Diaz his little brother versus George St. Pierre, and he reacted to his little brother's post that we covered yesterday. Now, with that being said, this is Nate Diaz's post, and this is what Nick Diaz put on top of it. He also went on to continue to accuse GSP of steroids. If you see the little emoji right here, the needle emoji with the muscle emoji, you know, clearly insinuating that GSP is on steroids, which is also what Nate Diaz said in his post. If you recall, Nate Diaz said GSP cheated when he fought his brother, and that he needs to clear that shit up before, you know, he can fight himself. Now, Dana White spoke with the LA Times, I believe, and he said that they're working on Nate Diaz versus GSP. And as I said, you can be interested and be working on it, but that doesn't mean the fight's going to come to fruition. Nick Diaz and Nate Diaz in the past have said that they don't want to take each other's fights. Nick Diaz has said he wouldn't want to fight Conor McGregor because that's his brother's fight. Nate Diaz has said he wouldn't want to fight George St. Pierre specifically as well because that's his brother's fight. And George St. Pierre also hasn't really shown interest in the past of fighting Nate Diaz. He's not a guy that's out here just saying, hey, I want a money fight. I want a money fight, which is really all Nate Diaz would be for GSP at this point, because GSP is a two-division champion, one of the greatest fighters of all time. He's made money in the sport. He's talking about, you know, legacy fights, and I'm sure he would like a money fight as well. And if Conor McGregor doesn't work out, Nate Diaz is probably the second biggest star in the UFC to date, now that Ronda Rousey's in the WWE, of course, and John Jones is out on a little hiatus as well. But with that being said, Nick and Nate Diaz are both pretty big stars in the UFC, but they don't want to step on each other's toes because they're fucking loyal to the soil, loyal to each other, and that's just how it goes. Now, with that being said, Nick Diaz has threatened to slap anybody that tries to make Nate Diaz versus George St. Pierre, as well as if GSP, he said if he hasn't heard George St. Pierre saying that he wants to fight Nate Diaz, but he said, I'm going to read exactly what Nick Diaz had to say. He said, gonna slap the shit out of anyone who's gonna try to make this fight so bitch made. I don't even think GSP said anything, but he could get slapped up on sight too if he did. So Nick Diaz ain't messing around, and if you guys recall, I don't know if this was a part of an agreement or what, but remember Nate Diaz and Dana White met up somewhere, and Nate Diaz just got to like slap Dana White on camera, like Stockton slapped Dana White. Looks like Nick Diaz might want a little Stockton slap of his own, and it might be Dana White, or it might be whichever matchmaker approaches Nate Diaz with the thought of the George St. Pierre fight. Now, with that being said, Dana White did say the UFC's working on that fight. Maybe they sent it to GSP or even Nate Diaz as well. But if so, looks like somebody's going to have to duck their motherfucking taco when they see Nick Diaz. Because if Nate Diaz gets a bout offer that says GSP, I think Nick Diaz is going to have a problem with that. But, now let's keep in mind, Nick Diaz versus George St. Pierre, what about that? Because, I mean, I just went this long. I'm surprised, and I didn't mention how long the Diaz brothers haven't fought, right? I'm thinking about, oh shit, who's gonna fight who? Oh shit, Nick Diaz or Nate Diaz? Who's fighting GSP? I didn't even realize Nick Diaz is off of suspension, so he can fight in the octagon. Nate Diaz, he was never suspended. He's just been out since he fought Conor McGregor. But George St. Pierre, he's definitely going to be, if he comes back, coming to a lower weight class. I think that's, if you haven't saw the picture, there's been pictures of GSP lately where he looked really skinny, and there's talks of George St. Pierre fighting at 155 pounds. Now, if he does fight at 155 pounds, I only see him going that low for maybe a Conor McGregor super fight, because that's just not only a legacy fight, it's not just a money fight with Conor McGregor at this point. It's also a legacy fight. He was the first guy to hold 2 belts in the UFC. If you beat him, that means something more than just a payday. But it does come with a very large payday as well. So with that being said, this is like, and I believe the MMA Beat talk about this, low-key like a little lightweight tournament that UFC could have going on with GSP versus Nate Diaz. Because you think about, look at the 4 of the potential best lightweights in the world, or the biggest stars in the UFC that could potentially fight at lightweight, right? George St. Pierre versus Nate Diaz. If that were to happen, Then you could also have possibly Conor McGregor versus Khabib. And then the winners fight each other. Holy smokes, like a little lightweight tournament. That's insane. Like, let's say GSP happens to beat Nate Diaz, and let's say Conor McGregor or Khabib, either one. If Conor McGregor beat Khabib, then we would have George St. Pierre versus Conor. If Khabib beat Conor, we would have George St. Pierre versus Khabib. That would be crazy, bro. If the UFC is able to put together Nate Diaz versus GSP, that could potentially set something like that up. But of course, Conor would have to fight Khabib as well, and it's looking like things are going that way. I mean, he's throwing dollies at Khabib's buses and shit. Khabib and Conor McGregor, like, they need to settle this. Send me location. You know what I'm saying? The location needs to be at a UFC event in 2019. If you ask me, 2018 actually. Now, with that being said, the hurdles, the UFC would still have to jump some hurdles as far as Nate Diaz versus GSP. Even though the UFC does have a tendency, if they really, really want something, to possibly get it done. But it would be hard to, you know, you would have to kind of come in between that brothers bond with Nick and Nate Diaz to get Nate Diaz to agree to fight GSP, because he's not shown interest in that in the past. So we'll see what happens. I'll definitely keep you guys updated. But as of right now, it looks like Nick Diaz has threatened the UFC or GSP if they try to make this fight with Nate Diaz versus George St. Pierre. He says somebody can get slapped up. So with that being said, it is what it is. Oh, quick. The steroid thing, I wanted to touch on that, because Nate Diaz also said that in his post. He said, you know, the Diaz brothers are saying that they feel like GSP cheated in the first Nick Diaz fight. They're saying that they feel like GSP was not only on steroids, they're saying he came in overweight and Nick Diaz was drugged before the fight. So they're saying when Nick Diaz fought George St. Pierre, he was completely, like, it was just not fair, essentially, right? That's if GSP was on steroids, it was pre-USADA, then that's one thing. You know, the Diaz brothers are notoriously against steroids, and that's not saying GSP was. We don't know that. I've seen some people bring up some shit about George St. Pierre and Vaseline, but that doesn't mean he was on steroids just because he might have did that once, right? And also, being overweight, that's a potential advantage in a fight. And then clearly, if you got a fucking bad IV from one of GSP's nurses, that would affect your performance. But the thing is, you would have to be pretty reckless, you know what I'm saying, to get an IV from one of your opponent's friends, unless you didn't know who it was at that point. But with that being said, maybe we see Nick Diaz versus George St. Pierre. There's been talks about that rematch happening from GSP's side, and Nick Diaz was actually seen not too long ago on like Reebok gear. So it was looking like Nick Diaz was gearing up for a UFC return. There's been talks on GSP side about that, so we'll see what happens. It looks like George St. Pierre could potentially be fighting a Diaz brother, not sure which one. One of the Diaz brothers in his return, and then of course Conor McGregor could be fighting Nate Diaz, George St. Pierre, or Khabib. But I think, you know, maybe we see Conor McGregor versus Khabib. I think that's the fight that has to happen. I mean, that's something, you know, they got to settle that. They got to settle that. With that being said, it is what it is. Let the full-time family know what you think in the comments. I'm out. And as always, thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit the subscribe button and also hit the notification bell right next to it so you're notified every time I upload a video. I'm out.
This is #1 bullshit.